Every night she sat there, alone, silent, and unnoticed at the train station. Most people walked by without a second glance, but one officer couldn't ignore her any longer. What he discovered about this young girl's heartbreaking story will leave you speechless. Stay with us, because the truth behind her nightly visits will change everything you think you know about compassion and humanity. Before we dive into this moving story, take a moment to comment below where you're watching from today. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will stay with you long after they're told. The clock on the train station wall ticked loudly, filling the cavernous silence of the nearly deserted platform. Midnight was minutes away, and the small town of Greenfield was already tucked in under a blanket of sleep. The air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen, and the dim station lights flickered intermittently, casting long, shifting shadows over the empty benches. Officer Mark Wallace sat in his patrol car, parked just outside the train station, the engine humming softly to ward off the chill. The station was part of his nightly route, a routine he had followed religiously for nearly 10 years. Greenfield was quiet, and quiet suited him just fine. At 44, Mark had learned to appreciate the stillness, the solitude that the late hours offered. His colleagues often teased him about his preference for the night shift, but Mark never minded. The nights gave him space to breathe, to think without the noise of the day intruding. But tonight his thoughts were anything but still. His eyes drifted back to the station, scanning the platform illuminated by the dull yellow light. At first, he thought it was empty, just as it was most nights. Then, there it was again, a small movement near the edge of the platform. He straightened in his seat, leaning forward to get a clearer view. The girl. For the 5th night in a row, there she was. She couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old. Her presence, at first curious, had quickly become unsettling. She always appeared around the same time, just before midnight. Small and slender, she moved with a quiet purpose, clutching a tattered backpack that seemed too heavy for her slight frame. Her hoodie was oversized, the sleeves swallowing her hands. The ribbons in her braids were faded and her sneakers were scuffed and worn, as though they'd been through more miles than they should have. She walked to the same bench every time, her steps deliberate, yet unhurried. She sat there, back straight, her gaze fixed on the tracks, as though waiting for something, or someone. Mark had tried to rationalize her presence the first night he saw her. Maybe she lived nearby. Maybe her parents were somewhere close, letting her wait for a relative or late train. But the second night had gnawed at him. By the third, he was certain. She was always alone. No parent, no guardian, no train. He adjusted his rearview mirror, watching her settle into her usual spot. She slid her backpack onto the bench beside her, her hands clutching it protectively. Her small shoulders were hunched against the cold, but she made no move to warm herself further. She didn't fidget or look at her phone like kids usually did. She just stared, her dark eyes unblinking as the faint rumble of a freight train echoed in the distance. Mark reached for his coffee cup, but his hands paused mid-air. Something about her, something he couldn't quite name, gripped him. It wasn't just her being there. It was the way she carried herself, the way her small frame seemed to hold the weight of the world. She wasn't just waiting for a train. She was waiting for something far deeper. He tried to brush it off each night, telling himself it wasn't his place. He wasn't her father or her teacher. But tonight, the unease gnawed at him more persistently. He had seen many things as a cop, but this was different. The loneliness that seemed to envelop her felt too heavy for a child her age. Mark leaned back in his seat, his thoughts turning inward. It was moments like this that made his job difficult. It wasn't just about enforcing laws, it was about knowing when to intervene. He had seen enough kids fall through the cracks, enough people look the other way when a child needed help. Was he doing the same? He exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the car window. The truth was, she reminded him of someone he hadn't thought about in years. His daughter, Emma. Emma had been close to this girl's age when she died. The memory hit him like a punch to the gut. He could almost hear Emma's laugh, her small hands tugging at his uniform when he came home from his shift. The thought brought a familiar ache, one that never really went away. He shook his head, trying to banish the memories. This wasn't about Emma. This was about the girl sitting on that cold bench, alone in the middle of the night. She wasn't his daughter, but she was someone's child, someone who deserved protection. Mark looked at the station again, his jaw tightening. He had spent the past 4 nights convincing himself not to get involved, but his instincts were telling him otherwise. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his gut. "All right," he muttered under his breath, grabbing his flashlight and stepping out of the car. The cold air bit at his face as he closed the door softly, the click of the lock breaking the night silence. The girl hadn't noticed him yet. She sat motionless, her eyes still fixed on the empty tracks. Mark hesitated for a moment. How would she react? Would she be afraid? Would she run? He didn't want to scare her, but he couldn't just stand by anymore. He had to know why she was here, night after night. Taking a deep breath, he began walking toward her, each step deliberate, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. As he approached, the girl turned her head slightly, her dark eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment before darting away. She clutched her backpack tighter, her posture stiffening. "Hey there," Mark said gently, stopping a few feet away. He kept his voice low, calm, non-threatening. "It's pretty late for you to be out here. Are you waiting for someone?" She didn't answer, her gaze dropping to her lap. Mark crouched slightly, trying to meet her eyes without invading her space. "I'm Officer Mark Wallace," he said, tapping the badge on his chest lightly. "I just want to make sure you're okay. Can you tell me your name?" Still, she didn't speak. Her small hands gripped the straps of her backpack tightly, her knuckles white. Mark's heart ached at the sight. She wasn't just shy. She was scared. And whatever fear she carried, it was bigger than him, bigger than this station. He tried again, softer this time. "Look, I'm not here to get you in trouble. I just want to help. Is there someone I can call? A parent? A guardian?" The girl's shoulders hunched further, and for a moment, Mark thought she wouldn't answer. But then, in the smallest voice he had ever heard, she whispered, "There's no one." Mark blinked, her words hitting him like a freight train. He felt a lump forming in his throat, his professional composure slipping. He wanted to ask more, to probe further, but he knew better than to push. "Okay," he said gently, sitting down on the bench, leaving enough space between them to keep her comfortable. "No one, huh?" His voice was soft, almost to himself. "That's a hard place to be." The girl glanced at him briefly, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite decipher. Fear, sadness, maybe even hope. It was enough to break whatever hesitation he still had. He wouldn't leave tonight without understanding her story. The girl's small frame seemed swallowed by the stillness of the train station. She perched on the bench with her backpack balanced carefully beside her, her hands resting in her lap. Mark noticed how she barely moved, as though trying to make herself invisible. Her posture wasn't relaxed, like a child waiting for a train or simply taking a break. It was tense, deliberate, her shoulders hunched slightly forward, as if bracing against something unseen. Mark leaned subtly against the station wall, his eyes tracing her every movement. It was the 5th night in a row she'd been here, and each night she followed the same routine. She arrived just before midnight, walking quickly from the shadows beyond the station. She would glance nervously over her shoulder before stepping onto the platform, her small figure illuminated briefly under the flickering lights. She carried the same backpack every time, a faded, scuffed thing that looked older than she was. Her grip on it was almost possessive, her knuckles tightening whenever anyone walked past, even at a distance. On some nights, Mark had seen her unzip it briefly, rummaging through the contents with careful precision before zipping it shut again. He could never quite make out what was inside, but he had noticed the edge of a worn blanket peeking out once or twice. What struck him most, though, was her silence. She didn't fidget or hum, didn't play on a phone or talk to anyone. Even when others occasionally wandered through the station, a janitor cleaning the floors, a night shift commuter catching a late train, she stayed quiet, her gaze fixed ahead. It wasn't the stillness of calm, it was the stillness of someone trying not to be noticed. Mark's concern deepened with each passing night. The way she moved was cautious, almost practiced, as though she had learned to navigate the world in a way that avoided drawing attention. She glanced at the station clock often, her eyes darting nervously to the tracks, the street, and the parking lot. But no train came, and no one ever met her there. He'd caught snippets of conversations about her over the past few days. Greenfield was a small town, and it didn't take long for people to notice something unusual. "That little girl's been here every night this week." A station janitor had muttered to a coworker, "She doesn't talk to anyone, just sits there like she's waiting for something." "You think she's lost?" the other man had replied, shaking his head. "Or worse." Mark had overheard similar murmurs at the diner down the road. One of the waitresses mentioned seeing the girl pass by on her way to the station. "Always looks like she's in a hurry," she'd said. "Poor thing, what's a kid her age doing out this late?" The questions gnawed at Mark. Was she lost? Running away? The more he watched her, the more he realized she wasn't waiting for a train or a person. At least, not in any conventional sense. She was waiting for something else entirely. On the fifth night, Mark decided to observe her more closely before making his approach. He parked his car a short distance away and stood by the station's edge, careful to stay out of sight. The girl arrived at 11:54 p.m., just as she had every other night. She emerged from a side street, her small figure darting between pools of streetlight and shadow. She hesitated briefly at the station entrance, her head turning sharply, as though listening for something. Satisfied that no one was following, she stepped onto the platform and made her way to the same bench she always chose, the one farthest from the main entrance. Mark watched as she set her backpack down and pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. She didn't take out a phone or any other belongings, just stared ahead, her expression unreadable. It wasn't the blank stare of boredom, but something far more complex. It was the look of someone lost in thought, or in memory. The minutes ticked by, and Mark noticed the subtle patterns in her behavior. She would glance at the clock every so often, her brow furrowing slightly, then shift her gaze to the tracks. Occasionally, she'd clutch her backpack closer, her fingers gripping the straps tightly, as if it held something precious. Mark's years as a cop had taught him to read people, to pick up on the small details that told a story, and this girl, despite her silence, was telling a story louder than words. She wasn't just wandering or killing time, she had a purpose, even if Mark couldn't yet discern what it was. The way she moved and acted suggested she was used to being on her own, making herself as unobtrusive as possible. It was a survival mechanism, one he had seen in kids who had grown up too fast. Her backpack, though tattered, seemed to be her lifeline. Mark guessed it held more than clothes, perhaps food, a few belongings, maybe even something sentimental. The way she kept it close, always within arm's reach, spoke volumes about its importance. Then there was her avoidance of people. Even when the station janitor walked by with his mop, she stiffened slightly, her body tensing as though bracing for an unwanted interaction. When he passed without noticing her, she relaxed again, her shoulders loosening only slightly. It wasn't normal, not for a child her age, and it wasn't safe. As the clock ticked past midnight, Mark felt the familiar knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He knew what he was seeing. This girl was alone, in a way no child should ever be. She wasn't here by accident or coincidence. She was here because she had nowhere else to go. Mark's mind raced through the possibilities. She could be a runaway, scared and desperate to avoid being found. Or worse, she might be part of a bigger problem: homelessness, neglect, even trafficking. His experience told him that kids like her didn't just slip through the cracks. They fell hard, often into places far darker than a quiet train station. He thought of the statistics he'd read, the grim reports that crossed his desk. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, more than 400 cases of endangered runaways were reported in the last year alone. Many of those children faced unimaginable dangers, from exploitation to violence. Some of them were never found. Mark couldn't bear the thought of this girl becoming another statistic. She was here, in front of him, and he had a chance to help her. He couldn't let it slip away. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his uniform and stepped out of the shadows. The girl didn't see him at first, her eyes still fixed on the tracks. But as his boots crunched against the gravel, she turned her head sharply, her dark eyes locking onto his. Mark hesitated at the edge of the platform, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. The girl had noticed him now, her small body stiffening as her dark eyes darted toward him. For a moment, she looked like she might bolt, her fingers gripping the frayed straps of her backpack with an intensity that made his chest ache. He paused, keeping his distance, his hands out at his sides to show he meant no harm. "Hey there," he said gently, his voice low enough not to startle her. "It's pretty late to be out here all by yourself." The girl didn't respond. Her eyes flicked to his badge, then back to his face, assessing him with a guarded wariness far beyond her years. She shifted slightly on the bench, inching her backpack closer as though it held everything she couldn't afford to lose. Mark knew better than to push. Kids like her, kids who had learned to survive on their own, didn't open up easily, especially not to someone in uniform. He decided to keep it simple. "I'm Officer Mark Wallace," he said, crouching slightly to bring himself closer to her eye level without looming over her. "You've been coming here a lot lately. I just wanted to make sure you're okay." The girl's jaw tightened and she looked away, her silence speaking louder than words. Mark noticed the subtle way she tucked her chin down, her fingers nervously twisting a loose thread on her hoodie. It was a classic defensive posture, a way to shrink herself, to disappear. Mark took a slow breath, fighting the urge to press her for answers. He knew that pushing too hard would only make her retreat further. "All right," he said softly, standing back up and taking a step away to give her space. "If you need anything, I'll be around." He turned and walked a short distance down the platform, but he didn't leave. Instead, he leaned casually against the station railing, his eyes flicking back to her every so often. He wanted to give her time, to show her he wasn't a threat. Still, the tension in her small frame lingered, her fingers gripping her backpack like a lifeline. As the minutes passed, Mark found himself scanning her belongings, searching for anything that might give him a clue about her situation. Her backpack was old, its fabric worn thin in places, with a few loose threads trailing from the seams. He caught a glimpse of something inside, a corner of a tattered blanket, a small stuffed animal with its fur matted and faded. The sight of it made his heart clench. It wasn't the kind of thing a child carried for convenience, it was the kind of thing they carried for comfort, for a sense of safety. He remembered something one of his colleagues had mentioned years ago during a training session. "Kids in tough situations," she'd said, "hold on to what's familiar. It's not just about survival, it's about having something that feels like home, even if home doesn't exist anymore." Mark's gaze shifted back to the girl. She wasn't waiting for anyone. She was holding on to that bench, that bag, that station as if they were the only constants in her world. He frowned, his mind piecing together what little he knew. If she had a family, they weren't here. If she had a place to stay, it wasn't one she wanted to be in. Whatever had brought her here night after night, it wasn't something good. The next morning, Mark decided to dig deeper. He made his usual rounds through town, stopping by the places where people like to talk: the diner, The gas station, the post office. In a town like Greenfield, you didn't need a formal investigation to find out what people knew. All you had to do was listen. At the diner, he overheard the waitress, a kind woman named Patty, talking to one of the regulars. "That girl's been at the station again," she said, shaking her head as she poured coffee. "I see her walk by every night, same time. Poor thing. She's too young to be out there on her own." "Think someone ought to call CPS?" the man replied, his voice low but concerned. Patty sighed. "Maybe, but you know how these things go. They'll take her in, and then what? She'll just get lost in the system." The word stuck with Mark as he left the diner. He couldn't argue with Patty's logic. He'd seen it too many times before. Kids shuffled from one place to another, never finding the stability they needed. If that was the case for this girl, then the system wasn't the solution. Not yet. At the gas station, the clerk, a younger man named Joe, had his own observations. "She's quiet," he said, leaning on the counter. "Comes in sometimes to buy chips or soda. Always pays in cash. Doesn't talk much, but she's polite. I figured maybe her parents are working late or something." Mark nodded thoughtfully. It was a reasonable assumption on the surface, but his gut told him otherwise. If she had parents working late, why wasn't she home? Why was she sitting alone on a cold bench in the middle of the night? That night, Mark returned to the station, his unease growing with every step. He saw her again, sitting in the same spot, her small figure, illuminated by the flickering light above. This time, he noticed something he hadn't before, a faint tremor in her hands as she adjusted her backpack. She was cold, maybe even hungry. Her hoodie, thin and frayed, wasn't enough to keep out the chill of the autumn air. He stood there for a moment, torn between his instincts as a cop and his compassion as a human being. He had no solid evidence to act on, no concrete proof that she was in immediate danger, but everything about her, the way she moved, the way she avoided eye contact, the way she clung to that bench as if it were the only stable thing in her life, screamed that something was wrong. Mark made his decision. He couldn't walk away, not this time. Taking a deep breath, he approached her again, his steps careful and measured. "Hey," he said softly, stopping a few feet away. "It's me again. Mind if I sit?" The girl didn't answer, but she didn't move away either. Mark took that as permission. He lowered himself onto the bench, leaving plenty of space between them. "You know," he said, his tone light, "I come here a lot too. I guess we're both night owls." She glanced at him briefly, her expression guarded but curious. Mark smiled faintly. "I've been seeing you here a lot, and I can't help but wonder, is there someone you're waiting for?" This time she didn't look away. Her eyes met his, and for a split second he saw something in them. Fear, yes, but also a flicker of trust. It was small, fragile, but it was there. "No," she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. "There's no one." Mark nodded slowly, his heart aching at the quiet finality of her words. "All right," he said softly. "But you've got me now, and I'm not going anywhere. Kid?" He shook her shoulder slightly, his heart pounding now. She stirred faintly, her head lifting just enough for him to see her face. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused, her lips pale and trembling. "I'm okay," she murmured, but her voice was so weak that Mark had to strain to hear it. "You're not okay," he said firmly, his concern deepening. "When's the last time you ate, or drank some water?" She blinked at him, disoriented. "I don't know." Mark swallowed hard, the weight of her answer settling like a stone in his chest. She was exhausted, dehydrated, maybe even sick. He glanced around the station, half expecting someone to emerge from the shadows to claim her, but the platform was empty. Just her. Just him. "All right," he said gently, standing and reaching for his radio. You're coming with me." Her eyes widened at that, panic flashing across her face. She tried to push herself up, but her legs buckled beneath her, sending her back onto the bench. "No," she gasped, clutching at the armrest to steady herself. I can't go." Mark crouched down again, his hands out in a calming gesture. Hey, it's okay. I'm not taking you anywhere you don't want to go, but you're not staying out here like this. I'll take you somewhere safe, I promise." She shook her head frantically, tears welling in her eyes. "No," she whispered. "They'll take me away. They always do." Mark's heart broke at the raw fear in her voice. He didn't know who they were, but he could hear the weight of her experience in those 3 words. This wasn't a runaway with a bad attitude or a kid testing boundaries. This was a child who had been failed by people, by systems, by the world. He took a slow breath, softening his tone. "Listen to me," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "I'm not them. I'm just a guy who wants to help. You're not safe out here, and you can't keep doing this alone. Let me help you." She stared at him, her small hands trembling as they clutched the edge of the bench. Her lips parted, as though she wanted to say something, but no words came. Instead, she closed her eyes, her body sagging as though the weight of her reality was finally too much to carry. Mark took her silence as a sign. "Okay," he said quietly, "let's get you some help." He stood and retrieved her backpack, carefully tucking the spilled items back inside. He hesitated for a moment, then reached down and scooped her up. She flinched slightly at first, but then she went still, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. "You're safe now," he murmured, his voice more for himself than for her. "I promise, you're safe." Mark carried her to his patrol car, his steps quick but careful. The girl's body felt too light in his arms, her thin frame a testament to how long she had been struggling. He placed her gently in the passenger seat, buckling her in before pulling a spare blanket from the trunk and draping it over her. As he started the engine, she stirred slightly, her eyes opening just enough to meet his. Where are we going?" she asked weakly. Mark glanced at her, his jaw tightening. "To the station," he said. "It's warm, it's safe, and we can figure things out from there. You'll get some food, some water, and then we'll talk. Sound good?" She nodded faintly, her head resting against the window. Mark reached for his radio as he drove, calling into dispatch. "This is Officer Wallace. I need immediate assistance at the station. Minor involved, possible neglect. ETA, 5 minutes. The dispatcher's voice crackled back. "Copy that, Officer Wallace. Assistance will be ready." Mark hung up and focused on the road, his thoughts racing. He didn't know this girl's story yet, but he knew enough to realize that she was in trouble, deep trouble. And whatever it took, he was going to make sure she got the help she needed. When they arrived at the station, Mark guided her inside, keeping his movements slow and careful. She clutched the blanket tightly around her shoulders, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "It's okay," he said softly. "No one's going to hurt you here." She nodded, but her grip on the blanket didn't loosen. Mark led her to a small break room, where he pulled out a chair and handed her a bottle of water from the mini ridge. "Here," he said, watching as she took it with shaky hands. "Drink this. Slowly." She took a few hesitant sips, her eyes never leaving his. Mark sat down across from her, his voice calm but firm. "I need you to trust me. Can you tell me your name?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. Finally, she whispered, "Amara." Mark nodded, the name settling in his chest like an anchor. "Okay, Amara. That's a beautiful name. Can you tell me why you've been at the station every night?" Her hands tightened around the water bottle, her small frame trembling. I don't have anywhere else to go," she said finally, her voice breaking. I wait there for my mom." Mark's heart clenched, his breath catching in his throat. "Your mom?" he asked gently. "Where is she?" Amara's lip quivered, tears spilling over her cheeks. She left. She said she'd come back, but she didn't. I thought if I stayed, she'd find me." Mark felt his chest tighten as her words settled over him. She was waiting for someone who wasn't coming back, and she had been waiting alone. He placed a hand over his heart, steadying himself. "Amara," he said softly, "I promise you, you're not alone anymore. We're going to figure this out together." Her gaze met his, the fear and sadness in her eyes slowly giving way to a flicker of hope. Mark knew he had just crossed a line from cop to protector, from bystander to someone who was going to make a difference in her life, and he wouldn't stop until she was safe. Amara sat across from Mark in the dimly lit break room, her small hands wrapped tightly around the water bottle. The oversized hoodie she wore seemed to swallow her whole, a makeshift shield against the world. She looked so fragile, her face pale and streaked with drying tears. Mark sat silently for a moment, letting the hum of the vending machine fill the space between them. He didn't want to push her too hard, too fast, but he knew they couldn't stop here. "Amara," he began gently, his voice steady and soft, "you said you're waiting for your mom. Can you tell me a little more about her?" She didn't meet his eyes. Her fingers twisted around the bottle's cap, her lips trembling as though she were trying to form the words but couldn't. Mark waited, giving her the space she needed. Amara started, her voice barely above a whisper. "She always said we'd be okay, that no matter how bad things got, we'd get through it. Together." Mark leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. "Where is she now?" he asked softly. Amara's breath hitched, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice so quiet it barely reached his ears, she said, "She left 2 months ago." The words hung heavy in the air and Mark felt his stomach tighten. "Do you know why she left?" he asked, carefully. Amara's fingers fidgeted with the hem of her hoodie. "She's lost her job," she said, her voice faltering. "We couldn't pay for the apartment anymore. She said she'd find work and then come back for me." Mark's heart broke at the simplicity of her explanation, the way she clung to the belief that her mother had every intention of returning. He had heard stories like this before, had seen how desperation could drive people to make impossible choices. But hearing it from the mouth of a child, this child, made it feel unbearably personal. "She left me with her friend," Amara continued, her voice trembling. But they didn't want me there. They said I was too much trouble, so I left." Mark felt his chest tighten further. "How long have you been on your own, Amara?" he asked, his voice barely steady. She shrugged, the small motion carrying a weight far beyond her years. "I don't know. A while." Mark exhaled slowly, his mind racing. 2 months. 2 months of sleeping in train stations, of clutching that backpack like it was her only tether to safety. 2 months of waiting for someone who might never come back. Amara's small voice filled the room again, her words halting but steady, as though she had been holding them in for so long they had begun to spill out of their own accord. "I thought if I stayed at the station, she'd find me," she said, her gaze fixed on the table. "It's where we used to go sometimes, to watch the trains. She said they'd take us somewhere better one day." Mark nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He understood now. The station wasn't just a random place, it was a connection to her mother, a symbol of hope she couldn't let go of. "I try to stay out of sight," Amara continued, her voice growing quieter. "I don't want anyone to take me away. I don't want to go to those places." Mark's chest ached at the fear in her voice. He had seen those places she was talking about, the overcrowded shelters, the foster homes that didn't always offer the care kids needed. He understood why she was afraid. But the thought of her alone, sleeping on benches or in dark corners, made his stomach churn. "You've been very brave," Mark said finally, his voice soft but firm. "Braver than anyone should have to be. But you don't have to do this alone anymore." Amara looked up at him then, her eyes wide and filled with a mix of emotions. Fear, uncertainty, and the faintest glimmer of hope. You mean that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mark nodded. "I mean it. I'm not going to let you face this on your own." As Amara's story unfolded, Mark couldn't help but feel the echoes of his own past rising to the surface. Her fear, her determination to hold on to hope despite everything, reminded him so much of Emma. He thought about the nights he had spent sitting by Emma's hospital bed, holding her small hand and whispering promises he couldn't keep. "I'm going to make this better, kiddo," he had told her once, his voice breaking as she drifted in and out of sleep. "You just hang in there." But Emma hadn't hung in there. The illness had taken her too quickly, leaving him with nothing but an empty house and the suffocating weight of his failure. Now looking at Amara, he felt the same fierce protectiveness he had felt for his own daughter. He couldn't save Emma, but maybe, just maybe, he could save this little girl. Mark cleared his throat, forcing himself to focus on the present. "Amara," he said gently, "do you have anything else with you? Any family? Anyone I can call?" She shook her head. "It's just me." Mark leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "We'll figure this out together. First, let's get you some food. How does that sound?" Amara hesitated, then nodded, her small shoulders relaxing just slightly. Mark stood grabbing his coat. "Come on," he said, offering her a hand. "There's a diner just down the road. They've got pancakes as big as your head." Amara managed a faint smile, the first he had seen from her. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him hope. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Mark felt a quiet resolve settle over him. He didn't know what the next steps would be, finding her mother, navigating the system, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let this girl slip through the cracks. Whatever it took, he was going to make sure Amara never had to wait on that bench alone again. Mark drove through the quiet streets of Greenfield, the faint hum of the patrol car's engine blending with the sound of Amara's steady breathing. She sat beside him, wrapped in the blanket he had given her, her small frame barely filling the passenger seat. Every so often he glanced at her, noting the way her fingers gripped the edge of the blanket as though it might disappear if she let go. His mind raced, trying to piece together the best way to help her. He had seen too many kids like Amara, children caught in the cracks of a system that wasn't built to catch them. He knew this wasn't going to be simple, but he also knew he couldn't abandon her to a cold bench and a broken promise. The diner was quiet when they arrived, the faint smell of bacon and coffee lingering in the air. Patty, the waitress Mark had overheard earlier, looked up from behind the counter and immediately noticed the small figure trailing behind him. "Evening, Officer Wallace," she said, her voice cautious as her eyes shifted to Amara. "Who's this?" Mark gave her a tired smile. "This is Amara. She's in a bit of a tough spot. Thought she could use some pancakes." Patty's face softened and she nodded, grabbing a couple of menus. "Take a seat anywhere. I'll bring you the biggest stack we've got." Mark guided Amara to a booth near the window, the warm glow of the diner's lights making her look even smaller. She slid into the seat, her hands still clutching the blanket, her eyes scanning the room nervously. "You're safe here," Mark said gently as he sat across from her. "Patty's good people. She's not going to bother you." Amara nodded faintly, but she didn't relax until the pancakes arrived, steaming and topped with a generous dollop of whipped cream. She hesitated at first, glancing at Mark as though waiting for permission. He gave her an encouraging nod, and she picked up the fork, her movements tentative. As she ate, Mark pulled out his notebook, jotting down everything she had told him so far. He needed to approach this carefully. Calling Child Protective Services, CPS, was the logical step, but he also knew how often kids like Amara got lost in the shuffle. He needed to gather as much information as possible before making that call. "Amara," he said softly, careful not to interrupt her too much. "Do you remember where your mom's friend lived? The one you stayed with?" She paused, her fork hovering over the plate. "It was near the market," she said hesitantly. "By the big sign with the flowers." Mark nodded, mentally marking the spot. "And your mom, do you know if she was looking for work in town or somewhere else?" Amara shook her head. "She didn't say, just that she'd come back." Mark leaned back, his jaw tightening. He didn't want to fill her head with doubts, but the likelihood of finding her mother quickly, or at all, felt increasingly slim. Still, he wasn't going to give up. For now, he had to focus on keeping Amara safe. The next morning, Mark sat at his desk in the station, his fingers hovering over the phone. He had already sent an officer to check the area near the market, but no one had seen or heard of Amara's mother. Now, it was time to call CPS. The phone rang twice before a woman's voice answered. "Child Protective Services, this is Monica Dawson." "Hi, Monica. This is Officer Mark Wallace with Greenfield PD," Mark began, his voice steady but firm. "I've got a situation with a minor. Her name's Amara. She's been living on her own for about 2 months, and her mother appears to be missing." Monica sighed audibly on the other end. 2 months? That's a long time for a kid to be out there. Is she safe now? "It's Heltana," said Mark. "It's her to the end, and it's a compliment to have Hannah showing up as well. She's with me," Mark said. "I've got her here at the station. We've taken care of her immediate needs. Food, water, a safe place to rest. But she needs more than I can give her." "Understood," Monica said. "I'll head over right away. We'll need to start the intake process, but I'll need details about her situation to figure out the best placement." Mark hesitated. "Look, Monica, I know how this goes. I've seen too many kids like Amara end up in temporary placements that aren't built to handle what they've been through. I want to make sure she doesn't get lost in the system." Monica's tone softened. "I hear you, Officer Wallace. I'll do everything I can to make sure she's placed somewhere stable, but this is going to take time." Time. That was the one thing Amara didn't have much of. Monica arrived an hour later, a tall woman with kind eyes and a firm handshake. She sat down with Mark in the station's small meeting room, her notebook already open. Amara sat nearby, her head bowed as she hugged her backpack. "Amara, Monica said gently, leaning forward, "I'm here to help. Can you tell me a little about what's been going on?" Amara looked to Mark, her eyes wide with uncertainty. He gave her an encouraging nod. "It's okay," he said softly. "She's here to help." Amara's voice was barely audible as she recounted her story again, this time adding small details. How her mother had promised to come back before school started. How she had slept in the station bathrooms when the nights got too cold. How she avoided adults because they always asked too many questions. Monica nodded as she listened, her pen moving quickly across the page. When Amara finished, Monica looked at Mark. "We'll need to start by filing a report and opening a case. I'll also contact local shelters to see if they have any leads on her mother." Mark frowned. "Shelters might help, but I don't want her bouncing around if we can avoid it." Monica met his gaze, her expression thoughtful. "You seem pretty invested in this case, Officer Wallace." Mark hesitated, then nodded. "I am. She's been through enough." Monica closed her notebook, her expression softening. "Let's see what we can do." Word of Amara's story began to spread through Greenfield. Patty from the diner organized a small fundraiser, collecting clothes and supplies for Amara while spreading the word about her situation. Joe from the gas station offered to cover her meals if she ever stopped by. Even the janitor from the station dropped off a warm coat mumbling something about not wanting her to freeze out there. For the first time in months, Amara began to smile. A real smile, not the fleeting guarded one Mark had seen before. The town was rallying around her, and she was beginning to feel like she mattered. As the days passed, Mark found himself becoming more protective of Amara. He knew the system would eventually require her to be placed in a foster home, but the thought of her being taken away gnawed at him. He had lost one daughter. He couldn't bear the thought of losing another child who had come to mean so much to him. One evening, as Amara sat on the station bench, watching the trains pass with a quiet contentment, Mark made a decision. He called Monica. "I want to apply to foster her," he said, his voice firm. There was a pause on the other end. "That's a big step, Officer Wallace. Are you sure?" Mark glanced at Amara, her small figure framed by the fading sunlight. "I've never been more sure." It was a chilly evening, the kind where the wind carried whispers of the coming winter. Amara sat in the front porch of Mark's small home, bundled in the oversized coat Patty had donated. She clutched a mug of hot cocoa, steam curling up into the crisp night air. Mark sat a few feet away, his own mug resting on the wooden railing. The two of them sat in silence, the quiet punctuated only by the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hum of a train on the horizon. Mark had decided to bring Amara to his house for the evening. Monica had approved it as a temporary arrangement while they waited for the next steps in the foster application. He figured it would help her feel safer than the sterile walls of the station. Amara's shoulders were still tense, her small frame huddled against the cold despite the warmth of the cocoa. She hadn't said much all evening, answering Mark's questions with short, careful words. He could tell she was still holding something back. Something big. "Nice night," Mark said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, not expecting a reply but hoping to ease the tension. Amara nodded slightly, her gaze fixed on the trees lining the edge of the yard. Mark took a sip of his cocoa, his hands warming against the ceramic mug. "You know, Emma, my daughter, she loved nights like this," he said softly. "She'd make me sit outside with her and count stars. Always insisted she could see patterns I couldn't." Amara glanced at him briefly, her expression softening just a little. Did she like trains?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Mark smiled faintly, the memory bittersweet. "She loved them. Used to beg me to take her to the station just to watch them come and go. Said they reminded her of possibilities. Places she could go someday." Amara's fingers tightened around her mug. "My mom used to say the same thing," she murmured. "The trains take you to better places." Mark felt a lump rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down. "She sounds like a dreamer," he said. "That's a good thing." Amara nodded, but her lips trembled slightly, and Mark saw the sheen of tears glistening in her eyes. She blinked rapidly, trying to hide them, but he caught the faint hitch in her breath. "Amara," he said gently, leaning forward. "It's okay to feel sad. You've been carrying a lot on your own for a long time. You don't have to anymore." Her grip on the mug tightened, her knuckles white against the ceramic. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice breaking. What if she's not coming back?" Mark's heart clenched at the raw fear in her words. He set his mug down and shifted closer, keeping his movements slow and careful. "It's okay to be scared," he said softly, "and it's okay to miss her. But you're not alone anymore, Amara. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." She looked at him then, her dark eyes wide and filled with uncertainty. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, she placed the mug on the porch beside her and turned toward him, her small hands clutching the edges of her coat. "I don't want to be alone anymore," she said, her voice trembling. Mark felt his chest tighten, a mix of relief and sorrow flooding through him. "You're not," he said firmly. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Amara hesitated, then moved closer, her small frame leaning tentatively against his side. Mark froze for a moment, startled by the gesture. Then he gently draped an arm around her, holding her close. She was so light, so fragile, but there was a strength in the way she let herself be held, a trust she hadn't shown before. They sat like that for a long time, the night settling around them like a blanket. Mark felt the weight of his own grief shift, the ache in his heart softening as Amara's presence filled the empty space he had carried for so long. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. "You saved me," Amara whispered, her voice muffled against his jacket. Mark shook his head, his throat tight. "No, Amara," he said quietly. "We're saving each other." The next morning, as the sun rose over Greenfield, Mark found Amara sitting by the window, her hands resting on the sill as she watched the light creep across the yard. He walked over, setting a plate of pancakes on the table behind her. "Good view?" he asked, leaning against the wall. Amara turned to him, a shy smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "It's nice here," she said softly. Mark smiled back. I was thinking, maybe this weekend we could take a little trip. There's a train museum a couple of towns over. It might be fun." Amara's eyes lit up, the first spark of genuine excitement he had seen in her. "Really?" "Really," Mark said. "It's a promise." For the first time, he saw her shoulders relax completely, the tension melting away as she nodded eagerly. In that moment, Mark knew they had turned a corner. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were facing it together. And for the first time in years, Mark felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change, marked by moments of both challenge and hope. Mark threw himself into the process of fostering Amara, his days filled with paperwork, interviews, and home visits from Monica. Every step brought its own hurdles, but with each one he became more certain that this was the right path, not just for her, but for himself as well. Amara, too, was changing. The quiet, guarded girl he had found at the train station was slowly emerging from her shell. She began to smile more, her laughter soft but genuine when they made pancakes together on Saturday mornings. She started asking questions about the stars they watched from the porch at night, and even helped Mark plant a small garden in the backyard. One day, as they were cleaning up after dinner, Amara looked up from the sink where she was rinsing plates. "Do you think she'll ever come back?" she asked softly, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. Mark paused, the dish towel in his hand. He had thought about this question often, knowing it lingered in her mind like a shadow. He walked over, crouching beside her to meet her gaze. "I don't know, Amara," he admitted honestly. "But what I do know is that you're not alone anymore. Whether she comes back or not, you have a home here, with me." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they didn't spill over. Instead, she nodded, her small hand reaching out to grip his. "Thank you," she whispered. Mark squeezed her hand gently, his throat tight. "You don't have to thank me, kiddo. You're family now." The adoption hearing was held on a bright spring morning, the courthouse bathed in sunlight. Mark sat beside Amara in the waiting room, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. She wore a simple yellow dress, one she had picked out herself during their last trip to town. He could see her nerves in the way she twisted the hem of the fabric, but there was also a quiet determination in her eyes. When their case was called, they entered the courtroom together. Monica stood by their side, her presence steady and reassuring as the judge reviewed their file. Amara sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, while Mark answered the judge's questions with calm certainty. Finally, the judge looked down at them, her expression softening. "Having reviewed all the evidence and testimony, I am pleased to approve this adoption. Congratulations, Mr. Wallace. Amara is now officially your daughter." The words hung in the air for a moment before sinking in. Mark felt a wave of emotion crash over him. his breath catching in his chest. He turned to Amara, who was staring up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Really?" she whispered. Mark smiled, his voice thick with emotion. "Really?" Amara threw her arms around him, her small frame trembling as she hugged him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice filled with a mix of relief and joy. Mark hugged her back, his eyes misting as he whispered, "Welcome home, kiddo." The weeks that followed felt like a fresh start for both of them. Amara's room was painted a bright yellow, just as she had wanted, with butterfly decals decorating the walls. Mark made good on his promise to take her to the train museum, where she spent hours exploring the exhibits and learning about the history of locomotives. But the most profound change came in the small, everyday moments. The way Amara started humming to herself as she helped with chores, the way she greeted him with a smile when he came home from his shift, the way she began to speak openly about her dreams for the future. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Amara turned to Mark. "Do you think she'd be proud of me?" she asked, her voice tentative. Mark didn't need to ask who she meant. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze steady. "I know she would," he said firmly. "And I think she'd be proud of how strong you've been too." Amara smiled softly, leaning against him as the sky turned shades of pink and orange. "I think she'd like you," she said after a moment. "You're good at being a dad." Mark felt his chest tighten, warmth spreading through him. "And you're pretty great at being a daughter." Months later, they returned to the train station, not as a place of sorrow, but as a symbol of their journey. Amara insisted on bringing flowers, which she laid gently on the bench where Mark had first found her. "This is where it started," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mix of gratitude and reflection. "But it's not where it ends." Mark nodded, his arm draped around her shoulders. "No, it's not," he agreed. "We've got a long road ahead and we'll face it together." As they stood there watching a train pull into the station, Mark felt a profound sense of peace. Amara wasn't just a child he had rescued, she was his family. And for the first time in years, he felt like his life had purpose again. The train's whistle echoed in the distance as they turned to leave, walking side by side toward the life they were building together.